So we have over 100 people to be letting in. So we'll let that go for a little bit before we get stuck in. And welcome everyone. I think we're getting there. Okay. So we're just 1 minute, 2 minutes past our starting time. Let's see. Okay. Hi, Olga. Some people cameras on, some people aren't, right? So you can see who is there. Thank you from Richard Potts. We hope we will have a great event. Bill, nice to see you. All right. And actually, hi, Andrew. That's a good reminder that I will be, I'll welcome you in a minute, but I will be checking the chat, as will Roxanne, for questions. So I'll keep an eye on that. We just welcome everyone in. We have quite a high number of registrations for this. I think we've topped over the 300 mark. So we'll just see if we start letting people in. Oh, lovely. Hello from Dakar. It's one of the great things about these webinars. We get people from all over the world joining in. And of course, today's topic is on everybody's mind as well. Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on, oh, Antigua and Barbuda. I think we could probably do it from there next time. How about that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Aussies. Well, maybe soon we'll be able to. And one of the things we'll talk about today is what that might entail in terms of the way we get on a plane and prove ourselves. That would be lovely. I have to agree. Right. Thank you to everybody who's joining us. And look, it's lovely to have your company. We have some Aussies, we have people from Tunbridge Wells, the Philippines, everywhere. It's always nice to know where people are from. Yeah, it's raining in Sussex and everywhere else as well. To see what something like a topic like this is topical all around the world. And it's great that you are making time to stay with us today and join us to have this discussion. It's great to see everyone with Turkey, Bangladesh, everyone. It's amazing, isn't it? How something like this travels around the globe. So I will continue, as I said, to check the chat, as it were, and where it's raining and where it's not. But welcome to this webinar on digital identity. I'm Helene Panzerino, and I'm the Associate Director at the London Institute for Banking and Finance, Center for Digital Banking and Finance. And of course, this is a topic where we look in digital banking and finance and fintech as well. Before I get stuck into today, just a reminder for the 24th, where we'll be having a half-an-hour webinar on the PG Cert, Postgraduate Cert in FinTech, which is going to be launching very soon. So hopefully we'll see you there and you'll join us for more information. Isle of Man, we love the Isle of Man, but on a day like today, we wouldn't get a flight there. Okay, so today we're talking about the role of digital identity in supporting the economy, improving access to finance, and protecting consumers and businesses. And I'm never alone on these webinars. And today I'm very excited that I'll be joined by Dave Birch and Gareth Narayan-Singh, and we'll talk about them in a minute and have their introduction. But I just want to set the scene a little bit and say, I think that digital identity has been on everyone's mind, layperson or someone in the industry, because of COVID and access to stimulus packages, COVID passports, and wondering what will happen when we can fly again. Can we travel again? We've all got very used to doing things digitally in our banking world. We're used to biometrics, for example, now in terms of identification, or more use than we were before. We know that approximately 12% of the population turned on to a digital banking app and used it during the first lockdown. So we're all getting a bit more adept at it. Traditionally, as a nation, we've pushed back on things like national IDs, where they exist in other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, in India, for example, as well. So we're now coming to this point where accessing things that happened during COVID and stimulus packages and benefits and everything else, we had a difficulty with ID, and we'll talk about that. And I just want to set the scene from our point of view as industry and as lay people. Now, before we get stuck in, let me get an introduction from our two wonderful guests. I feel a little bit humbled in this space. Really? Gareth Narayan-Singh is the commercial director for Yoti, the ID platform. And as I said, Dave Birch, author, consultant, advisor, and very much at the fore of digital identity around the world. So Gareth, can we get a bit of an introduction from you, and then we'll move to Dave.
Yeah, hi everybody. I hope you can hear me and see me okay.
Yes.
I'm Gareth. I work for Yoti, which is one of the most well-known digital identity platforms in the world. My career background in coming to Yoti is as follows. I spent 11 or 12 years in banking, working across various roles in front office, middle office, eventually ending up in debt capital markets. I then spent a few years at the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, where much of my work revolved around financial crime remediation programs. I then went to Deloitte, where most of my work revolved around financial crime remediation programs. And whilst I was at Deloitte, I came across this small, tiny startup called Yoti, who were doing great things in the world of digital identity verification. And I thought that this had enormous potential and power for use in financial services for risk mitigation, for identity fraud and other things. And I really wanted to kind of use Yoti as a platform to build out products for regulated financial services firms to make it safe to onboard customers, but also to give customers a great customer experience as they're onboarding.
In a very true fintech way, isn't it, Gareth? That great customer experience. Thank you. You've obviously touched the subject from a variety of angles and points, large consultancies and small startups as well. So it'd be great to see your view around that perspective. Dave, let's get it. For those of on our tiles that haven't come across you or don't know you or haven't read one of your books.
What?
I know, I don't.
I thought you weren't going to let them in. That was the deal.
That was the deal.
You're too generous, Aline. Well, I have a lot of experience in the payments and banking space, and many years ago, working on next generation financial services products, particularly the customer facing stuff around payments, it became quite clear to me, and actually I'm sure lots of other people as well. I mean, I'm not the only person that thought of this, but it became very clear to me that most of the problems we were dealing with were really identity problems. And if we could fix digital identity, then a lot of the other problems would fall away and a lot of the other costs would disappear. So I became very interested in understanding more about identity. I edited some work around that, and then that led me to go on and write a book about it, and I've been quite obsessed with it ever since. So my point is, digital identity it allows us to attack a fundamental friction in the financial system, and in reality we've made no progress on that in the last generation. So we're overdue to do something about this.
Thank you very much, Dave. I hadn't realized how you got into it or what the attraction was in the first place, and I can totally understand that, because I feel with both of you, as I started this saying, that COVID has really made us all aware, and other changes, whether you're setting up a new company, or you're opening a bank account, or you're trying to access the stimulus package, there are jams all along the way with identity, because we don't have something that crosses, is interoperable and is portable. But before we get into the detail, yeah, I think it's also clear for us to just set the definitions, right? Because I think it's also one of these things, what we might have different ideas about what it means. So I'd like to ask each of you, what do you mean by digital identity?
Well, for me, it's, I am very old and reactionary and conservative, so I have a very kind of rigid definition of what this is. So for me, digital identity is the bridge between the mundane and the virtual worlds. So there's well, we'll go into this a bit more detail, but there's me in the real world, well, Woking, which is so there's me, but then online there's lots of different virtual me's, right? So when I go round to the store around the corner to buy something with my John Lewis card, it's not really me buying something from the store. It's like my virtual credit account somewhere in cyberspace, doing business with, the store's virtual self somewhere out in cyberspace, So the actual transactions take place between these kind of virtual identities. Meanwhile, in the real world, there's me, my mundane identity. And digital identity is the bridge between the two things. And so if you see digital identity as that link, I think it clarifies a lot of the thinking around it. But yes, you're right. When I say digital identity, I'm not talking about something generic. I mean something really, I mean very specifically that link between real and virtual.
Thank you very much. Very clear. Gareth?
Well, I think a lot of people are familiar now with, onboarding to digital banks and fintechs. So a lot of people are now familiar with, Monzo, Revolut, Starling, the way they do things, presenting yourself in front of your device, doing various tests. But actually, that isn't digital identity. That is what I would call digital identity verification.
Or onboarding.
Yeah, that's right. Digital identity, from a technology perspective, certainly from the Yoti perspective, means being able to own your identity, your unique identity, on your mobile device. And Yoti comes in the form of an app. It's free to download. It's been downloaded 10 million times all over the world to date, 2 million times in the UK. And that app contains a digital wallet. Metaphorically, it's a digital wallet. That wallet consumes attributes of your identity that we can extract from your passport, your driving license, your national ID card, and it can go further than that. So not only can I use my digital wallet to share my identity online, to tell you who I am, how old I am, my nationality, but actually we want to be able to consume more and more information, from your medical records to your university records, whether you have a right to work, whether you have a right to remain in the country that you're in. So you can begin to build up all these credentials within the wallet that actually give more and more information about your identity. But actually, we want that identity to be kept extremely securely. So it's, very secure in the event that someone will eventually, inevitably try to hack that. And also we want to keep it private as well, so that, you are only sharing attributes that you need to share to make the other person comfortable. And a big example for that is age verification. So in order to buy an age-restricted good or access maybe an age-restricted content online, and it's all about sort of protection of minors in that regard, I don't have to tell you my name, I don't have to tell you my address, my date of birth. I just need to share with you an attribute that says that I'm over the age of 18, and that attribute has been derived from my identity. So that's the way we think about identity at Yoti. And I think, it's been a journey to kind of sell this into governments and commercial businesses. But actually, the big catalyst has been COVID, actually. So that is a driver now that means that a lot of enterprises are now looking at digital identity seriously with a view to deploying it rather than just exploring it.
And back to Dave's point of saying, like, we talked about it a lot, we've skirted around it a lot, but we need to do something. And something that you mentioned in terms of attributes versus, and you also mentioned the device being the phone, and then there's something that about me was something that only I will know about me. Maybe it's helpful to break down, either of you, some of these parts of digital identity, because we've spoken about different things. What are, why do we have attributes versus the device versus something that I know that only I can know about me, and how do they come together?
I think a very simple way of thinking about it is what we call the 3D ID, the 3-domain model of digital identity that I developed with my colleagues at Consult Hyperion. And that says, well, look, you have digital identity in the middle, right? And you have real and virtual identities either side. So the link between digital identity and the real identity, as Gareth just mentioned, that takes place in the identification domain. So identification is one thing, like binding that digital identity to the identity in the real world. That's the identification domain. And that's complicated and expensive, and because I just have to say, by the way, I was just talking to my son earlier, and one of my sons is opening a bank account, a savings account, and he went to open it online and was told he couldn't open it online. He had to go to a local branch of major UK bank. So he took his driving license, and because he's living in a flat with his friends and the driving license is in his home address, he can't use the driving license to open his bank account. So they instead said he had to go and get his passport, which of course doesn't contain an address in it at all, to open it. And this sort of nonsense goes on a million times a day all over. I mean, the whole thing is ludicrous. He's had an account of Barclays since he was 13, but Lloyd's treat him like he just got off the boat. You know, the whole thing is absurd and a complete waste of everybody's money. And as the figures demonstrate, actually does nothing to intercept criminal funds or whatever. So identification, that's complicated, expensive. We want to minimize the number of times that we do that binding between real and digital. Ideally, we only want to do it once. We'll come back to the role of banks in that later on. Mm-hmm. Then there's the digital identity itself, the life cycle of that digital identity, and in particular, as you've just mentioned, proving that it's you. So when you use that digital identity, how do you know it really is me using it? And actually, to be honest, that authentication domain is not troublesome. I mean, I'm exaggerating here a bit, but essentially it's a solved problem, because we already know the best way to do that, which is, you know, biometric authentication against tamper-resistant hardware, i.e. your iPhone or, you know, whatever. So I'm not too bothered about that sort of works. But then you've got the use of the credentials, the attributes that are associated with the digital identity. That's the authorization domain. And the general principle of financial services should be to migrate all interactions into that authorization domain. So things get done or not done on the basis of what you are or are not allowed to do. It shouldn't. So, you know, it's like if I present my phone to the door shouldn't be finding out who I am and then looking me up in a database. The door should be looking for a credential on my phone which says you're allowed through this door. And to Gareth's point, I'm trying to prove that I'm over 18 to buy a drink. Who I am and where I live is none of their damn business. It should be, you know, is this person over 18 or not? I've just posted into the chat. I like identity stories of all kinds, but I just posted into the chat my favorite, because my favorite attribute related stories, because they're the most horrific, are medical. It's like every other week there's a story in the papers about some Eastern European plumber who claimed to be a dentist and was drilling holes in people's teeth and things. And there's one here about a woman who claimed to be a plastic surgeon that was arrested while she was operating on somebody's nose, right? And that sort of stuff is in the digital world, requesting, you know, do you have this attribute? Is it attested to by somebody I trust? In other words, is it a credential? And can you prove to me that you're in the digital world? These things are trivial, and it's astonishing that we still mess around asking people for bloody British. I mean, I was just reading about electronic voting yesterday, about British gas bills as the gold standard of identity throughout the country. So identification, we know how to do it, but it's expensive. Authentication, we know how to do that, and actually pretty standard and pretty well available. The nut to crack is authorization. So when you say about things like vaccine credentials, which I'm sure we'll touch on with Gareth in a moment, you know, the issue isn't me finding out who you are. The issue is me understanding that you have a relevant credential that's in a format that I can understand, which is cryptographically protected, so you couldn't forge it, which is bound to you and not anybody else, which was issued by somebody who I trust, and blah, blah, blah. So I think all the interesting action actually is in the authorization space, not in the identification or authentication spaces.
That's interesting. Can I just ask a question, Helen, if you don't mind?
Of course.
Dave touched upon identification being expensive. I don't necessarily reconcile with that statement. What do you mean by that, Dave?
Well, I mean, so for example, suppose we want to use a sort of digital identity system. So somebody has got to scan my passport and check it against a passport database or whatever they're doing with it, or they've got to read my driving license and blah, blah, blah. We've managed to drive the cost of that down to you know, a few dollars, pennies in some cases.
Pennies, that's right.
But the problem is that in financial services, in order to turn that into a business, we have to deal with the liability that goes with it. So in other words, if Yoti say that I'm Dave Birch, and I go and open a bank account and it turns out I'm not Dave Birch, can Yoti afford the multi-million-dollar fines from the district court in Waco, East Texas? And the answer to that is probably no. So in order to be able to make that function, we've got to find a way of managing that liability, which means the checks on who I am have to be done to a really high degree, but we minimize the number of times that they're done. Like if you could do that check once, but like to the absolutely nth degree, you're absolutely totally, you've seen my bank account, my DNA, pictures of my cat, whatever it takes, you know for certain I'm Dave Birch, then you can afford to take on board the liability and take it away from other people who need to know that I'm Dave Birch. And then we have a functioning market.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my riposte to that is as a commercial supplier, so we often have to undergo extremely rigorous procurement exercises and due diligence to get anywhere near a sniff of integrating our technology into the banking platforms.
Well, as you know, I know that because I did one of them. that's how I know you guys.
Of course. So yeah, the systems and controls are tested to the nth degree. And I mean, just very, very quickly, just to kind of explain how our interpretation of identity verification. So it's a very, very quick journey for the customer. So the first thing we do is we ask the user or the customer to hold up a copy of their identity to the camera. So whether it's a mobile device camera or a webcam on a laptop, we ask them to take an image of it. So by clicking a button, but actually we're taking multiple images of that document. And those images are being reviewed by a person in a very secure compound based in the UK for data sovereignty. And we have trained people looking at those documents for the security features, the data position, the font, the color of the font, and we're looking at the hologram, and actually through the burst of images, we're trying to look at the movement of the hologram as well. So we're basically authenticating that it's a genuine document. The next thing the user is asked to do is present their face to the camera, and they're asked to do a very simple but active liveness test. So they have to, in our tech, you have to move your face towards the camera and away from the camera. And our machine learning is looking at the face. It's kind of looking at the contour to see that there's depth. It's looking at the distance between the various features of the face. It's putting anti-impersonation algorithms across the face so we can check if someone's wearing a mask or if someone is wearing an alteration technique. And the very last phase of that happens behind the scenes is that we're matching the facial biometric template that we've captured to the photo on the photo ID to check that it's one and the same person. So all in all, you get really strong assurance that it's a real person and that the person is the person who they say they are. Now, compared to many internal practices and procedures within the banks, that is way beyond what they're currently employing. So actually, from a procurement process, and coming back to the point about liability, we believe that the banks who've taken our technology on actually think that this is a huge improvement in terms of their current management of identity risk. And of course, under the senior managers regime in the UK, it's actually the individual who is accountable within the bank for using an outsourced service such as Yoti. So in that way, we sort of understand the liability risk, but through the robust procurement exercises, we actually think firms are generally very happy to deploy us.
So so just to be clear, because I'm obsessed with issues of interchange and liability. So most of the people watching this, because they're people in banks, they can't really think in other ways, Gareth. We have to explain it to them in their framework.
There are questions in the chat around ethics around this and around.
Well, you'll need a separate thing to explain ethics to them, Helene. So let's skip over that for the moment. But my question is this: this is the question of whether a digital identity system will transform the market or not. If I walk into a bar and the system says I'm over 18, and it turns out I'm not over 18, and the person running the bar gets fined £1,000 or whatever it is at the moment by the government, does the digital identity system take liability for that £1,000? If the answer is yes, then finally we have a working digital identity market. If the answer is no, then we've still got a way to go.
Yeah.
So I mean, and I'm listening to both of you, and I'm thinking about the people that are with us today. And as you mentioned, they're in banks. And as you're both talking, I'm thinking, why wasn't it a bank? Why aren't banks in the best position when they have access to our sensitive data? We have a relationship with them already. Well, how did it happen that they're not?
Well, that's like saying, you know, how come banks didn't invent Square? You know, how come banks didn't invent Stripe? I mean, like, if you applied logic to any of these things, banks would already be doing this. But that's not how the way things work in banks.
It was an opportunity for example, a federated or a portable identity, where if I have a bank account with the Spanish bank that has a relationship in maybe a correspondent way with another bank, that I could open that account there in another country because I've been my ID has been verified by the first bank. These kind of things seem
well, actually, Citibank, there was a very good report put out by Citibank a little while back, which I haven't got it in front of me, but I think it was called The Case for Federated ID. I can't remember, but I agree. You know, if you and I was on the joint Tech UK you know, working group on what was then called the Working Group on Financial Services Passports. And if you progress on the basis of logic, since the banks have already done the KYC, they've already sunk those costs, the logic, but not monetize them in any way, the logical thing to do would be to have a federated bank identity system, a bit like they have in Scandinavia with bank, but obviously next generation, kind of more sophisticated version of that. That would be the logical step forward. But I have to say, and I hate to be the spirit of, you know, gloom and doom on this sort of thing, I haven't seen the slightest evidence that this is ever going to happen. Hence, you have people trudging up and down high streets with copies of their passports and gas bills still.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I suppose the conversation heated up a little bit when the European Union was looking for every nation state to submit its national identity program. And as a German Italian, I was quite surprised that both of my nations put theirs in first. Everyone else was kind of not getting there. And that moment of saying, well, we have to put forward a national identity scheme, and we have something that we can have that's federated and portable and works across not only our internal needs, but we can do that with other countries. So wouldn't that have been a great thing? But we don't seem to. So I'm actually checking some of these dates. You're saying the UK doesn't need a national identity; it needs a national entitlement system. And with COVID vaccinations, a digital identity passport, some of which already have come onto the market, a necessity. As someone, Graham, I think you've mentioned what I said in the beginning, that we push back on national ID. So how do you get a standardized step by step so that we don't wind up going now from what we've learned, particularly in the last year, and say we're going to do 5 different versions or 3 different versions of something that is standardized within their silo and doesn't cross everywhere, you can't port it. How do we avoid, what are the steps that we need to think about to avoid duplication?
Well, the reason why I say a national entitlement system rather than a national ID system is that one of the objections to a national identity system in the UK, in America, in Australia, basically in, you know, what you might call the Anglo-Saxon world, because obviously we regard national identity cards as symbols of continental tyranny that take us back to the days of Napoleon, and we can't bear the thought of it. But the point is, in most I mean, I saw this the other day from the minister for something or other. He said you have to prove your identity thousands of times a day, but of course you don't. You know, you know, almost all of the circumstances where you're required to do some kind of thing like this, it goes back to Gareth's point. What you're actually proving is whether you're allowed to do something or not. Who you are should not be part of the conversation. And that's why I say a national entitlement system, not a national identity system. So when you go to the, I mean, again, we'll use the pub as the simple example. This is almost, when you go to the pub is not asking a national identity system, is this Dave Birch? The pub is asking a national entitlement system, is this person allowed to come into the pub? And that's a fundamentally different question. As to how we might get it, I think you're right to think about COVID as because for people like me, I mean, I've spent years assuming that at some point banks would exhaust all other possibilities and do the same thing. You know, I thought that would come at some point, despite no evidence of this ever happening, of course. But of course, along comes COVID. And now all of a sudden, it isn't just people trying to open bank accounts that need to act online. And I don't doubt from Gareth will tell us in a moment exactly where the growth is coming from on the Yoti side. But now all of a sudden it's people in health and education, and there's all sorts of other. And one that particularly I see in the corner of my eye is travel. Because IATA are already working on a global system for test results and vaccination passports. And I can easily construct an argument which says, well, why do I care about my stupid bank identity? It doesn't get me out of the house, right? If I want to go and watch a football game or go to the pub or go to the theatre, my bank identity doesn't help me, right? But actually, IATA identity does. So all of a sudden, suppose the IATA identities which are being used, like in my, I don't think British Airways is using it, but in the, like, so now I'm using my British Airways app to get into the pub. And then Weatherspoons were like, well, we've got an app anyway. Why don't we just use the IATA API? And so now all of a sudden my Weatherspoons app can show whether I've got a vaccine. And now I'm using my Weatherspoons app to get into the theatre. And if I want to book a cinema ticket online, I've got to show my Weatherspoons app. So the idea that it would inevitably be banks that would monetize the identification, authentication, and authorization is, I wonder. I think maybe I'm just wrong on this. Maybe it's the pub.
Oh, yeah. Maybe it could be somebody else. But actually, I personally have seen at least 3 or 4, I think, in the last 2 days, COVID passports. And I'll get to some of the questions that we have. Gareth, you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, with regard to banks, I mean, the most obvious use case for digital identity is around KYC onboarding, or electronic KYC, eKYC, as it's now commonly referred to. And actually, we believe that, you know, individuals, consumers should be in control of their data. So we actually think that, you know, it's not really the banks who are the data controllers, who ought to be the data controllers under GDPR. It's actually consumers. And of course, that is made entirely possible through means of the digital wallet. So actually, we think at Yoti, the banks are facilitators of digital ID because they are receiving, or they're relying upon, the data that the individuals hold. So our use case for this is about to hopefully enter the FCA's regulatory sandbox. We're waiting for confirmation later this month. But we've called it, we've given it a code name. It's called Project Endeavour. But actually, it relies upon the user having a digital wallet, like the Yoti app or like any others. They share their identity with the bank, or they consent to share their identity with the bank. What happens when they click consent is that actually they're consenting for risk screening. So their identity is then sent through a back office engine, which looks at whether they're a PEP, whether they're sanctioned, whether they belong on a watch list, whether there is any associated negative adverse media news around them. And if it all checks out, then they automatically get a credential into their wallet that says that on the 18th of March at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was screened. And actually that screen came back with a positive bill of health. There were no checks on me. I now own that information, and that information I've consented to share that with bank number one. Now I can walk around the digital market. So over the next few months or next couple of years, I might then use my wallet to take out insurance products, credit cards, maybe a mortgage, maybe another unsecured loan. But actually, every time I'm then using my identity with my wallet to share and take out a product, I'm getting another credential back into the wallet saying I was checked on the 5th of April, 2022, and I got a clean bill of health. It's all date and time stamped. The more I walk around the market or the digital ecosystem sharing my identity to get access to products and services, the more I'm building up trust in my identity. So every credential I get is giving me a higher trust score. It's a meta score, but it's a trust score. So actually, over the period of time, I not only have my identity on my phone, but I have really kind of enhanced the trust in my identity, and that's what we're working towards. So in a nutshell, it's putting the data back in control of the user, making them data controllers of their own personal information. We think it's the wrong thing to do for banks to be actually consuming information from customers and then effectively commercializing that, to use it as a commercial model to share that with other firms. That may be the route that other models might take in other parts of the world, looking to set up KYC schemes. But actually, we see that a different approach to that for the UK.
Okay, so back in my control, but presumably everyone in that network needs to be accepting this credential.
Putting, you know, I hate to argue with Gareth about, no, I don't, because it's kind of fun.
No, you don't, yeah.
But I'm unconvinced about this thing about putting people in control. You know, most people neither capable nor interested enough to actually do that. And if you just say, well, we'll put people in control, the first thing they'll do is just tick a box that gives Facebook access to all of their data. And you know, we're no better off. So I understand the sentiment, and I agree with the sentiment, but I think we should have an institutional framework which requires the institutions to look after people's data and protect it. Because I think, you know, we have regulators and we have ombudsmen, and I don't know. It sounds nice to say put people in control, but I would need a lot more convincing that that's a viable way forward, to be completely honest.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think we're moving into an age whereby people are becoming more concerned about their personal information and data, and who has access to it and where it's stored. So, you know, to sort of suggest that, you know, an institution would then become the controller of your data goes a little bit sort of contrary to that direction of travel, I think. I also think that, you know, the way we want to kind of see the financial services sector move with regards to KYC onboarding, it's not actually taking a record of my name, my date of birth, my passport number. It's just to receive that credential. So it's metadata. So I am trusted by a third party, and I've been verified to be me. I'm then sharing that trust credential with you. So actually the bank doesn't need to know all my details. It just needs to know that I'm trusted. And actually, I think that is a much more pragmatic and better way to kind of, you know, share your data, rather than having your data just scattergunned out there in the digital ecosystem.
No, I'm not saying scattergun. I think what I'm sort of imagining is, and again, this may never happen, what I'm sort of imagining is, if I need to prove to the pub that I'm over 18, what in essence ought to happen is that the pub should find some trusted credential. And so I can imagine a situation where I've essentially deposited my data into the bank, right? So the bank knows that I'm over 18, you know? So the bank gives me a credential that says this person is over 18. And that's what I show Wetherspoons. And Wetherspoons see, oh, this person's over 18. I trust the credential because it comes from Barclays. And by the way, I can sue them if the person's not over 18. You know, who I am is never part of that transaction. My real identity stays locked up, safe in the bank vault. And I can impose rules on the bank, which I'm not sure I can impose on people. So I mean, that's not the only way forward. For example, I happen to be the ambassador for FinTech for Jersey, and obviously I won't, you know, waste your time by setting out the manifold and obvious benefits of Jersey as a location for FinTech. I mean, they're so obvious; it doesn't really need me to say it. But there's some interesting discussions going on in that context about the idea of putting, because of the trust laws, about putting data into trusts. And I think this might be another way to explore going forward as well. So if people can deposit their data in a bank or in a trust, where there are rules about what that data can be used for and who it can be given to, but in particular, those organizations can take advantage of the developments in technology, homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs, cryptographic blinding, in order to have an environment that delivers both privacy and security, precisely because, to your point, it allows attributes to be used in transactions, whereas the identities are kept, you know, safely in trust, so to speak. So I'm not saying it has to be banks, but I feel some kind of institutional solution is required. And you know, I mean, I won't make the obvious joke, which I always do, which is, if anybody ever says in a conversation, well, people are concerned about privacy, So, well, obviously 2.5 billion of them aren't, because they're all on Facebook. So if you take a clipboard down the street and say to people, are you concerned about privacy? They'll say yes, but they're not really.
Actually, I mean, thank you, Dave, for replying to the blockchain questions in the chat while this conversation has been going on as one of the options, of course. There's mixed views also about people not wanting to manage their own identity. What happens if we have one identity and then it's used across a variety of the spectrum and it gets hacked? Then, is there a systemic risk in that? What about people who are outside of the usual or marginalized or maybe not involved in, for example, in financial services? What happens to them if they want to travel or they want to be part of this sort of passport scheme? So a couple of questions. There were about 35 questions actually coming through in the chat. So this has obviously got people going. So maybe the first one is, what happens if I have the one identity and I'm using it across a broad spectrum and it gets hacked?
Obviously, being a digital identity platform, we at Yoti treat people's personal information with the utmost security. What happens when you are identity verified by Yoti is that we take the attributes that we can obtain from the passport, or driving license, or national ID card, and we actually separate all of them. Each identity attribute, name, first name, date of birth, address, is separated. Each is individually encrypted by 256-bit AES, which is the most secure encryption you can get. We then separate all of the attributes into our secure data centers. And so even if a hacker could hack through the data center and could kind of grab loads of ID attributes and bring them down and decipher the 256-bit encryption, they would end up getting my first name, Helen's surname, Dave's date of birth. So actually you couldn't bring it down into a logical format to recreate the identity. The only person who can do that is the holder of the identity, because the private key is held securely on their device. So actually that means that we believe that at Yoti, we hold the information to an extent which is required to make it very, very secure indeed. It's kind of double, triple protected. And obviously, that is so important because every day, we are under attack.
I would agree with we are under attack, because it's happened to me a number of times. And I think, that's the other thing, Dave, you mentioned it before, that people go on Facebook and no one really cares. People get notifications all the time that there's been a data breach or something's been hacked, and it might escalate to something where your identity is at risk. And we've all read and heard the horror stories of what happens when it's your
if I see an email that says, your personal data has been compromised in an attack or whatever, I just assume it's phishing. I mean, if I see emails like that, why would I imagine an email like that will be anything other than an attempt to get more of my personal data? So like most rational people, I completely ignore it.
So I get the other question I'd like to deal with in the chat is people who are outside or who are marginalized or the disenfranchised group who are not accessing things that maybe the larger percentage of the population is. And if they want to engage in financial services or travel, and if we wind up having these kind of passported, identity driven credentials, what happens to them?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, from a Yoti perspective, the prerequisite requirement is that you have to have a smartphone. That smartphone has to be enabled so that it can hold the Yoti app, because that's where the digital wallet resides, and also it needs a camera, because we have to be able to see your face and perform a liveness test. So I understand that that isn't possible in all cases. It's not entirely inclusive. But that is the most secure way that we can offer to hold your identity, I'm afraid. So, clearly this means of digital identity doesn't work if you only have paper documents with no device behind it. Equally, I would say that, as a commercial vendor into financial services, there are so many firms out there who actually haven't gone through the digital transformation journey, who are still using, paper-based processes, manual end-to-end processes where there are physical handoffs from team to team. And actually, if you don't have the bare basics of a digital platform to integrate, products like ours and others through API integrations, then it's not really a starter. But I think that, over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen, huge amounts of progress in financial services for moving towards digital transformation and getting through the transformation journey. Unfortunately, or rather, well, it's not even unfortunate, it's just a fact of the market. The fintechs have done it first, and the fintechs are more agile. They built their platforms. They are easy to plug and play into. Whereas I have to say that most of the larger organizations, the tier twos, the tier ones, tend to have large clunky systems which attempt to communicate to each other in certain ways, and it's not always successful. And actually, those are the guys who really, really struggle to kind of deploy new technology, whether it's digital identity or other things, because connecting into them tends to be quite difficult. You need to raise budgets for IT programs. These IT programs are slow. The banks are not technology platforms, the fintechs are.
I mean, I think the technology issue, I think that's changed a lot recently. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was reasonable to hold technology up as a little bit of a barrier and say, well, how are we going to get the kind of coverage that we need in order to, it's all right for the half a dozen rich people who've got these smartphones and can use Yoti. But actually things have moved on a bit. I mean, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think don't 85% of the population have smartphones already? And we have new technologies coming along, particularly in the smart speaker and voice side of things, to pick up the slack from everybody else. So actually getting to the point where we can have pretty universal coverage of digital identity. I mean, I'm prepared to hear arguments that say otherwise, but I mean, my sort of feeling is we're pretty much there.
And I think part of the questioning comes from, because as we established early on, the whole globe is on with us today, other parts of the world where you're still not on a smart phone, and then that does cause, and as you probably were, this is needed. As you were both talking, and I don't know it in its detail, I was thinking about Aadhaar in India and what is that? You'll know it much better than me, but that seemed to be a solution in identity in a population where a large percentage of it is outside of the mainstream financial services.
I mean, I wouldn't want to minimize the astonishing achievement of Aadhaar. I mean, to bring to bring 1 billion people into a system is pretty impressive, but it's culturally and politically very specific. I can't see any circumstances in which a similar system would work in the UK. I do, I really don't want the government verifying every single transaction I get involved in and keeping all of my personal data in. So I mean, yes, it's impressive, but it's not what we want, and also it's not, I'm sure, what India will want in the future either, because I'm sure as the economy develops there, they'll want to move towards more sophisticated digital identity systems with different approaches to privacy and security. But yes, you cannot underestimate just how big the achievement is.
And I think the cultural point, again, we would say in China, where there's more information that's known about individuals, India, where there's more information known about it, we go back to this cultural thing. We couldn't even get it together with 28 states when there were 28 states in the European Union for cultural differences as well. So we can't underestimate that. I think, and as I said, we've been going down the questions as we've been moving along. One thing I wanted to ask you both is, the last year has shown us potentially what is the cost of not having a better digital identity system. As you were both talking yesterday, I was reminded of the fact that I opened a business account with one of the newbies, and I'm going back and forth actually uploading someone else's passport. I don't want to say this. At the same time, somebody who already has a bank account with this bank and they still want verification in the new digital world in this way, I've just been super frustrated, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, what I want to do is abandon the basket and just go back to somebody else where I know how to do it, and it's a lot easier. So there's an opportunity cost lost for this newbie. But what's the bigger cost for us as, for example, the UK, right? What if we don't get this right?
I think those kind of costs are sort of diffuse, and certainly in the era before the pandemic, I sat in countless meetings, as I'm sure Gareth has done, where there's someone down the other end that you're saying, well, like, we should have some sort of digital identity, and there's someone down the other end of the table going on about cost benefit and asking, well, okay, well, who's going to use these credentials in 5 years' time, and how much are we going to charge them? I'm like, I don't know. That's the whole point of building something new, whatever. But the Treasury's own estimates, never mind my estimates, which are much greater, but the Treasury's own estimates are that something like 25 billion out of 50 billion pandemic support loans are never going to be repaid. And in fact, I think the actual words used in the Financial Times were a giant bonfire of taxpayers' money with banks handing out the matches, because it proved so intractably complicated to figure out who anybody was. It was trivial for people just to make up fake companies and apply for these loans and then disappear. It's absolutely mad. Especially, and I should say that you have a lot of foreign people on the. They may not know that for, I assume, purposes of amusement only, the British Register of Companies, Companies House, doesn't even check if you're a real person. Never mind whether you're Dave Birch or not. They don't even check you're a person. Mm-hmm. So the company register is a joke. And the mechanisms used to link people to the company registers are a joke. And so it's no surprise the fraud is in the billions. So we've gone from trying to estimate what the benefits of a digital identity infrastructure might be, hard to say, they were diffuse. But now we know exactly what the costs of having a digital identity infrastructure, of not having a digital identity infrastructure are. So given 25 billion of taxpayers' money, I'm sure Gareth and I could come up with a solution. That's it's the new benchmark. It's like, we know that not having one cost 25 billion last year. So give us 25 billion instead of that stupid track and trace thing. What is that, 37 billion? Give us 25 billion and we'll build a digital identity infrastructure.
And this the arrival of something from left field, so to speak, that may or may not have been planned for, and that the emergency of it all, of course, to get money out to people, to businesses to continue to function, and hopefully some of them to survive. We went into emergency mode, and holes were shown everywhere in the banking system, in identity systems, in getting benefits out to people everywhere, right? So I guess, and this is one of those moments, isn't it? It's a seminal moment where you say, this is the time to fix it. Gareth, you think you can help us fix the problem?
I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that all the available technology exists out there, and we're not talking, future-proof tech. Future science fiction tech. We're talking about products which, the commercial market has bought today. Not all banks, has to be said, do their KYC to the required standards. Some do. We just need to create a more level playing field in terms of the standards and in terms of the investment in digital products to ensure that KYC is being done to the best of everyone's ability, because it's in everyone's interest. And there's no doubt in my mind that the products that are available today, had they been used for that scheme, would have prevented a large proportion of the fraud that we now know has taken place. So it's sad. It's sad.
It's very sad. Actually, just speaking, I feel my face wincing because I find this very painful, because businesses could use it. A lot of people could use it as well. I'm conscious we only have about 4 minutes left. So let's see. I know, Dave, you've been answering some of the questions. So Stephen, you bring up the point about TikTok, fraud on TikTok with bank transfer payments authorized.
I've no idea what TikTok is. So you'll have to explain that to me first.
It's something that the kids are down with, Dave. It's
I thought all the cool kids were over at Clubhouse with us, Helene.
now, and then we have, so if you have a smartphone, not everyone will want to use the technology. There are vulnerable people who are not tech savvy, of course, and younger people will grow up with digital identities. And on the vulnerability points, I suppose we all know that the FCA has been in this country very active on making sure that post-COVID, whether you're a business owner or you're an individual, that you're being treated in a certain way, whether you're vulnerable, to determine whether you're vulnerable and what happens versus being resilient. And again, I don't know how we're going to, if you're out of the system, how we're going to include those people in those conversations. So someone else is saying, could we conclude that the problem really is not necessarily with the tech, but with the humans? What a lovely question.
The problem's always with the humans.
I'm not really sure about that. But it's, you know, I don't know that I could say that because we don't have an infrastructure for people to use. So trying to understand where people would use it properly. I mean, you know, it wasn't that long ago, there was no such thing as credit cards, and now there's billions of them and everybody uses them, and nobody needs to understand the grammar of credit cards anymore. You know, you get off the plane in, or like in my case, I get off the plane in, where's somewhere far, I get off the plane in Bishkek and walk into a restaurant and I expect my card to work, and it does. You know, I get off the plane in New Zealand and I turn on my phone and expect it to work, and it does. So we don't have an identity infrastructure like that yet. So I couldn't say whether the problem's the technology or the people until we have it. You know, we need an infrastructure that works as well as those.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I know that there are some questions, Helen, but I mean, the thing that I want to say is that, you know, I think we live in an age where everybody is now, you know, hooked on being online. You know, they use digital pretty much 24/7.
I'm not. I'm sick of it. I've been on this Zoom. I've been on the Zoom for the last 8 hours.
But most other people are. And I think we'll look back in 10 years' time and we'll say, wow, that was like the Wild West. You know, how could we let our kids online, you know, communicating with people unchecked, seeing adult content unchecked? And I think the key to all of this is, you know, over the next few years, I hope that there will be a layer over the top of the internet, which is based on digital identity. And it's based on knowing who you are because you verified your identity, and therefore it knows exactly what it can let you see and what it can't let you see based on your age. And it will send preferences to you based upon your verified identity. So that's what I think will happen over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay. I think we've covered, we talked about, people were asking about criminals. And I think there was a question about the characteristics or the attributes of digital identity. We did touch on it before in terms of how it's broken down, but that was just one other question. Data breaches we've addressed, I think. And finally, Bezos claims Amazon is the infrastructure builder for the next era. Is it time to place that call? Thank you, Andrew.
Well, Amazon are launching their own money, aren't they, in Mexico? So I wouldn't really bet against them.
I don't know. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. And I think if we haven't addressed all the questions, and thank you, Dave, while you've been in there, as I said, answering things on blockchain, and we've addressed some of the things around fraud. I think we spoke about vulnerable people. We have agreed, I think, that the technology is there, and now someone actually just needs to do something to enable the technology to do what it needs to do for us, but that there is a huge cost, not just financial, but other costs, social, economic costs broadly, in not having a digital identity that is functioning the way that we need it to. And potentially one of the silver linings in this very horrible year that we've had is that this will be the trigger for us to get it right. So I thank both of our guests, and I thank everyone who's with us. And if we have missed any of your questions, we'll take them offline and then reply in the email.